California. Welcome everybody to the State Bar of California Audit Committee. I'm Mark Toney. I serve as chair of the committee. I am going to ask everybody to introduce themselves briefly. And I'm going to start with the trustees on the call. And I would first like to call upon Trustee Buenaventura.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Chair Mark Toney. My name is Ray Buenaventura. I'm the public defender of Lake County. I'm a state Supreme Court appointee, and I've been an attorney for 30 years, so I'm glad to be on here. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you for joining. Really appreciate it. I'm going to ask Trustee Chen to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Hyland Chen. I'm a Supreme Court appointee to the State Bar Board. I am in private practice at Munger, Tolles & Olson in Los Angeles.
Thank you, Trustee Chen. May I ask Trustee Huser to introduce herself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Huser, and I'm recently appointed as a trustee, and I am an in-house lawyer at Airbnb.
Thank you very much. Let us go ahead and ask Leah Wilson to introduce herself.
Leah Wilson, Executive Director.
Thank you. Aileen Dobkin.
Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Aileen Dobson, General Counsel for the State Bar.
Thank you. Louisa.
Louisa Repetian, Board Secretary.
Elizabeth Nolan.
Good afternoon, Elizabeth Nolan, Committee Coordinator.
Thank you. Liz Isakiza.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Isis-Kiza, and I am the committee coordinator as well.
Thank you. And I think we have, I can't see in the far conference room.
Hi, Mark. This is Alfredo Hernandez and the Office of the Executive Director.
Thank you, Alfredo. You were tiny on my screen, so thank you. I think that's everybody. So could I ask for the roll to be taken, please?
Buenaventura.
I'm present.
Chen.
Present.
Huser.
Present.
Toney.
Present.
Quorum is established.
Okay, this is the part of the agenda where we welcome the members of the public to make public comment. We offer members of the public up to 3 minutes to speak. And when you get to your 3 minutes, I will ask you to wrap up, and you'll be able to see a timer. And so I am going to first of all request help from the State Bar staff to call on members of the public who have signed up or who have their hands raised. So what do we, oh, I actually did, yeah, I think that's right.
We did have 2 people sign up in advance, but no one is raising their hands at this moment.
Okay. Let's have the people who have signed up first.
They didn't give us a name, so I cannot identify them unless they raise their hand.
Okay. Well, I will give a few seconds for anybody in the public who would like to speak, who would like to raise your hand on the Zoom function so that we can hear your comments. Okay. Well, given that I do not see any members of the public, I am going to head and move along to the rest of the agenda. So I'm going to start with the chair's report, which will be very brief. I basically wanted to give you a heads up that because we're meeting today, we will not have a meeting on the day of the board meeting later this month. And I am going to, my plan is that we will meet in between board meetings and not have committee meetings on the same day. I just think that's more effective. And that's what I plan going forward. We have, I think the next item is the approval of the minutes of our November 16 open session. And the first thing I'd like to do is to ask whether anybody has any corrections or modifications to the minutes. Okay, well, hearing none, I will entertain a motion to accept the minutes.
Move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, we have a motion and a second. May I ask the committee coordinator to call the roll?
Buenaventura,
Aye.
Chen,
Aye.
Fuser,
Aye.
Tony,
Aye.
4 ayes, 0 noes. The minutes are adopted.
Thank you very much. All right. So the next item on the agenda is the discussion with our auditors, Macias, Gini, and O'Connell, regarding the 2023 fiscal audit and discussion. This will be for discussion and presentation only. We have engaged them to do the audit. And it looks like we have Annie Louie joining us from MGO. And we also, looks like we have Araceli Montoya Chico, the CFO of the State Bar, joining us also. So unless there are further questions, I'd like to turn it over to our guests.
Sure. Mark, I'll start off really,
Please.
as a brief introduction before Annie starts. So good afternoon and Happy New Year to everybody. I wanted to briefly introduce Annie Louie, who's the new partner, or I should say the new partner on our audit with MGO. If the committee remembers, the prior partner was David Bullock, and as part of MGO's controls every so many years, and Annie maybe can shed more light on that, they rotate their partners. So I wanted to introduce Annie Louie as their new partner for this 2023 fiscal year's audit, and I'm going to turn it over to her as she presents an overview of the 2023 excuse me, audit. And also this is part of the responsibilities of auditors communications with those charged with governance, which of course is the audit committee. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Annie to start her presentation.
Thank you, Araceli. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Annie Louie. I'm the engagement partner or incoming engagement partner for the State Bar's audit, starting with fiscal year 2023. I have a short presentation to present to you today, which summarizes the content of the engagement letter that is part of the material that you should have in front of you. So if we can please move on to the next slide, the presentation will briefly walk you through the process. As I mentioned, or as Araceli had introduced me earlier, we have been selected to be the State Bar's auditor, external auditor for fiscal year 2023. I'm happy to be here today to have a direct dialogue with you. And that is the main purpose of the presentation, as well as upcoming meeting that we'll try to schedule with the Audit Committee, is to establish that two-way dialogue so that you can tell us directly any concerns that you might have, or other information that you believe would be relevant to the audit process. Next slide, please. We do have some new team members. As Araceli had mentioned, we, as part of our quality control, we like to rotate some key management of the team periodically. While there is a California legislation that requires a partner rotation every 6 years, we try to rotate it before then, just to kind of keep things afresh. So I will be rotating in as the engagement partner, as included in our proposal. We also have a new technical reviewer, Kevin Starkey, that will be doing concurrent review with me on the State Bar's audit. To keep that part of continuity for the day-to-day operation of the audit, and Gini Chen will be staying on as the senior manager, managing the day-to-day functions of the audit process. Next slide, please. In terms of the required communications with those charged with governance through the Audit Committee, during the planning process, we communicate our responsibility as the external auditor under the U.S. generally accepted audit standards on what we are required to do and the standards that we have to comply with. And we also communicate this time the planned scope of the audit to make sure there's no misunderstanding on what the audit covers, as well as the planned timing of the audit. When we're done with the audit, at the end of the process, we will come back to this Audit Committee and report on results of our audits, and that includes significant audit findings. And these are not necessarily deficiencies; it's what we found in terms of the audit finding in this sense. We'll also report on any qualitative aspects of the accounting practices, any difficulties that we may have encountered during the audit process, as well as any corrected or uncorrected misstatements that may be material and we believe warrants the attention of the Audit Committee. We'll also include any significant management representation that we may have received during the audit, any management consultations with other independent accountants. And what this means is if management had decided to consult with other accounting firms on maybe accounting matters or audit processes and whatnot, they have a responsibility to notify us, and we will report to you on such consultations if they should occur. And then lastly, if there's any other audit findings in terms of deficiencies or issues that we may have encountered, or even just comments for improvements in the process, we'll bring it to your attention at the end of the audit as well. Next slide, please. In terms of the auditor responsibilities, again, this is a summary. The engagement letter has a lot more details than what is presented here on the slide. But our objective of the audit is to provide an opinion on whether the financial statements of the State Bar prepared by management is fairly presented in all material respects. We will perform our audits under AICPA auditing standards, and if a single audit is applicable in a given year, we'll also follow government auditing standards as required as well. As part of our audits, we will consider internal controls over financial reporting as well as over compliance in the sense of in the case of a single audit, but we will not have any opinions provided over internal controls because the procedures that we will perform will not be sufficient to provide an opinion on internal controls for financial reporting and compliance purposes. As I mentioned earlier, if we should have any findings or deficiencies that warrant the attention of the Audit Committee, we will present that to you at the end of the audit. Next slide, please. We typically break out our audit phase into 6 steps. The first step is always communicating the terms of engagement, making sure that we all understand what the scope and the respective responsibility of the auditor as well as management are. And then we go through our informational gathering processes, and that includes meeting with the Audit Committee representatives, reading board minutes that have happened in the past year, and then just doing our research on what has occurred during the year to form our planning process. The third phase of the audit is to develop our audit strategy and to discuss that with management as well on what what we plan to do in terms of the testing, the scope, and the extent of that. And then execution is when we go ahead and maybe go through some sample selection, go through our analytical procedures, and make inquiries of management about information that we might need as part of the audit process. And then at the end of the day, in stages 5 and 6 is when we form our audit opinion on whether the financial statements are presented fairly, and to draft a report with management's review. And the next slide, please. As part of the audit process, as you probably know, there is that concept of materiality. An audit does not provide absolute assurance. It is here to provide what we call reasonable assurance. So we go through a materiality calculation on the opinion units on your financial statements, and then in the sense of a compliance audit, we also go through materiality for example, your federal expenditures to determine what we believe would be an amount that could influence the economic decisions of the users as well as the governing body as well. And we use that threshold to identify what we believe to be significant risk areas based on our information gathering and discussions with management and the audit committee. Next slide, please. What we also consider as part of our audit is fraud, and that is required under auditing standards. And fraud is defined in 2 specific terms. One is misappropriation of assets, and the second one is fraudulent financial reporting. So we'll go through a series of procedures to determine whether there are any particular risk of fraud that we should be considering as part of a financial statement and compliance audits, and we'll develop procedures to address those. Some of the more typical procedures that we will perform is journal entry testing. We will obtain a download of the State Bar's journal entries and determine whether there are any non-standard transactions or any transactions that may look like they're more risky than others, and maybe look into more details to the the reasonableness of those journal entries to make sure that they are made for proper reasons. And we'll also look into revenue recognition that is a fraud risk under the standards that we consider to make sure that revenue is recognized in the proper period and in the proper amounts. So those are some of the more standard procedures that we'll perform over fraud considerations. But a big part of that is also inquiries of management and the audit committee as well. And this is where you as the representative of the State Bar come in terms of your input of where you might think risk may exist that we should consider as part of our audit processes. Next slide, please. And then lastly, this is our confirmation of the different deliverables that we'll present to the audit committee at the end of the audit. The first one, of course, is the basic financial statement of the State Bar. We'll also conduct 2 examinations, one on the statement of expenditures of mandatory membership fees, and then the second examination is on the legal services trust fund. In years where the State Bar has at least $750,000 of federal expenditures, the State Bar will be subjected to a single audit, which we believe will be applicable for the calendar year 2023. And then the last report that we do is our direct communication to the governing body through the audit committee on the required communication that I mentioned earlier, as well as any matters in internal controls that we may have identified that warrant your attention as part of our audit processes. And then going on to the next slide. In terms of audit timing, we began planning procedures already through the engagement letter, confirming our understanding of the scope and our respective responsibilities. And then we'll go into the information gathering phase, and that will entail scheduling meetings with management as well as the audit committee representatives. We'll go through final field work around March after the books are closed. And this is the time of the audit where we really focus on year-end balances, going through some of the testing that I mentioned earlier. And the goal is to have the reporting done by the end of April. Next slide, please. Lastly, I'd like to close out with some new accounting standards that are applicable for the State Bar in 2023. So you may be seeing some changes in terms of how some things are being accounted for in your financial statements. There are three. GASB 94 relates to any public-private and public-public partnerships and availability payment arrangements. 96 are what you may have heard as subscription-based information technology arrangements, and these things are like software subscriptions. Is basically what this is. And then GASB 99 is just some cleanup language, if you will, to previously issued GASB standards. So we'll be working with management closely to make sure that these different pronouncements are implemented properly. And then going on to the last slide. If you don't know much about MGL, I really do encourage you, invite you to visit our website. We have a lot of different service offerings, and while we focus on state and local government, we also have teams that work on other industries as well. Okay. With that, I'd like to move on to the last slide and take any questions that you may have.
First, I want to thank you for your presentation here. Annie, it's very comprehensive. So what kind of questions do people got? Either about the presentation, about the audit in general, things that you were thinking, are they going to be covered or should be covered? Well, I'll get us started because you know I got a little list, and maybe this little list will help you in your thinking. So part of the way I see this audit, I see this audit both as a financial document, but also as a political document. And what I mean by a political document is I would like the audit to help answer some questions or respond to previous criticisms leveled at the State Bar around its finances and how it allocates its finances. So let me give you a very specific small example. One of the criticisms of the State Bar actually goes back to 2016. And it's about how much the bar used to spend on dinners at board meetings. Apparently it was tens of thousands of dollars. And there was a lot of noise about it. Rightfully so. I know for a fact that since I joined the State Bar 3 years ago, we have at our State Bar board meetings all paid for it out of our own pockets as trustees. I don't have any issue with that, but I'd like to get some credit for it. And I'd like to close the book on this being a issue that keeps coming up. And so I'm hoping that one of the things that the audit could do for 2023 is to look at the question of how much money was spent on meals. Now, there was some breakfast for a meeting and lunch, and I happen to know they were very reasonable. Okay, local vendors, little box lunches, so that's fine. I don't have any problem disclosing that. But particularly about the Thursday night dinner, which I know we pay for out of our pockets, I would like the audit to take a look at that. I know it's a small thing, and financially very small, but this is what we ought to be using the audit for, in part. Is that something you can do, Annie?
I think there are different ways that we can achieve that. One of the easiest way or most straightforward way is maybe to add a footnote in your financial statements that either discloses the amount in question, or there's different avenues. I think the short answer is yes, and we can talk about exactly what it is that you like to see and how that might fit in. Because I think to your point, such expenses normally would not be material. But if you do think that it's material for quantitative reasons, we can discuss the inclusion of maybe a footnote in conjunction with management to see, does that go into the financial statement or does that go into the examination report for the state, for the statement of expenditures or mandatory fees?
I think that sounds fine. A footnote would be fine. It doesn't have to be a separate line item by any stretch, okay? But I'd like some credit for paying our own way for the dinners, okay? There's no alcohol, not a dime spent on alcohol. That was part of the complaint before, okay? I understand it. But insofar as our practices have changed, I'd like some documentation of that. And you're the independent auditor. It has more weight coming from you than coming from us, right? Because you got independent credibility, okay? So let's go to the fraud risk area that you talked about. I was very happy to see that. And this is a question, if this is outside of the scope, I will understand it. One of the things is, and if anyone else has any other thoughts, is some of the fraud risk is mitigated by compliance with things like conflicts of interest rules, with the filing of Form 700s by the appropriate trustees, and there's a list of management. And I'm just wondering, and I'm opening this up to anybody who has a comment, if this audit could serve the purpose. And maybe we don't do it in 2023 because we're still in transition. That's okay with me. But audits in general, what do people think about the appropriateness where it says that, of those who are required to submit Form 700s, for instance, we had a compliance rate of 70%, 85%. I'd love to see 100 at some point, 20%. But something where we can also demonstrate our accountability to, legislators are going to be looking at this audit, okay? This is important to them. And I want to figure out a way to provide them some important information that will address and answer some of the questions that we've been subject to when we've gone up to Sacramento and had. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out and see what thoughts people have.
Well, I have a concern and question for the auditors on that, is whether you think that might create any conflicts of interest, because that could be considered more of a consulting engagement. And do you have any concerns along those lines?
Fair question. Thank you.
There are different ways that you can structure it. It could definitely be a consulting engagement, but it can also be an audit of compliance with specific requirements, such as this one. It wouldn't necessarily be part of the financial statement audit, even if we do consider compliance requirements, which we do, and fraud risk as part of the financial or the examination audits that examinations that we do. It is not something that you will see as part of the audit report because they're very strict language on what we can say in the audit report. I could report back on what we do cover in terms of compliance testing that we do. But if you're looking for specific procedures such as this one to be included, maybe we can talk offline on what those may be and how we can structure it, either as part of the audits that we include, if it makes sense to, in a report back verbally, or if we can do this as a separate engagement, if it's a lot more expensive than what has mentioned, extensive, sorry. So we can definitely talk about what your objectives are and what type of compliance requirements you're looking for. I do understand the State Board has internal control and internal controls review at least once every 5 years, so that may be covered as well. But like I said, if you are looking for something more than what you have going on, then we can definitely talk about it. One other recommendation or suggestion is something like that is typically covered by internal audit because they understand internal operations is something that can be done more regularly and frequently at your direction. So that is something else to consider. And if you're looking for the external audit for the other assurance, we can work with management to maybe schedule a different meeting to go do specifically what your objectives and needs are, because I do think there's a lot of different ways to structure it.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Trustee Huser, for bringing up the question. It's a very good question. And I think this is an area I'm a lot more flexible on. It was more of a question on my part. I'm happy we're going to get the dinners looked at, the meals looked at. Okay. I'm happy with that. But any other suggestions, thoughts, ideas that any other trustees have of, you know, what we want to see in this audit? Any other questions for our auditor, Annie Louie? Would you remind? I'm sorry, was that you, Leah, about to say something?
I didn't have a question. I was just gonna say.
Please.
Oh, just that the type of compliance review or audit that you're looking for, Mark. We are doing that internally.
Okay.
And we've created this transparency and accountability webpage that reflects the results. But if you think there's some value, and I think there may be lots of value to having an external review, I do think that's something that we could secure services to complete. It doesn't necessarily need to be our financial audit firm. It doesn't need to be MGO, but we could hire a different, including like a performance auditing firm, to come in and take a look. So happy to do that at the committee's direction.
Well, let's have further discussion before we commit to that.
Okay.
I appreciate you bringing that up. What I was going to do before we wrap up this section is to ask Annie Louie to please review the timeline in terms of maybe working backwards of, you know, when this is due, when you'll have drafts for us, because this will require at least one special meeting shortly before the audit is when it's in draft form before it's submitted. So could you kind of walk us through a timeline a little bit?
Certainly. I have talked through the timeline very briefly as part of my presentation. Like I said, we do begin planning now. In fact, we have a meeting scheduled with management to go over some of the specific questions, including timeline. After today's meeting, we want to make sure we present to the audit committee first. And so we'll be working through the details of that. But the plan is to go do some of the initial inquiries of management, as well as meeting with representatives of the audit committee, such as yourself. Sometime this month, hopefully, if we can make the schedule happen. And then we'll go through our internal informational gathering while management works on closing the books. And my understanding is around March is when the books will be closed and the draft financial statements ready for us to begin the audit process. And then around April is when we'll know what the audit opinion will look like, and that's when we'll go through the draft report with management and to present the audit results to the audit committee by the end of April, and we'll schedule that around that time. Does that answer your question?
It does. So my understanding is that the audit deadline is April 30th to be submitted to
it has changed.
That was recently changed, Mark, in the bill that just passed. It's no later. It's now it's May 31st is when the deadline has been moved to.
Excellent. That's a lot easier. So this will be the first year it's May 31st then.
Correct.
All right. Excellent. Okay, so we'll have a little bit more breathing room than we have in the past. So that's very, very good news. Thank you for that. And if there are no further questions, then I really want to thank Annie for her presentation and look forward to continuing to meet with you and work with you to get this audit completed. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for this presentation and opportunity to meet with you.
Excellent, excellent. So I think the next item we have on our agenda is a overview of the state bar's mandatory audits. This was something I was interested in at least reviewing so that we have a bird's eye view as committee members and can at least get updates on them. And Elizabeth, I believe you may have something to share with us here, if you would, please.
I do, yes. I am going to talk through it. The link is available on the website, but I can bring it up if that's helpful after I do my introduction. So good afternoon. The State Bar staff assembled a revised list of audits that are conducted at the State Bar, which was first presented to the Audit Committee at the November 2023 meeting at the request of the chair of the Audit Committee. So the purpose of the list in attachment A is to document and track the required audits that happen on an ongoing basis. There are 7 audits in the list now. So for context, the list of audits presented are those that are either required by statute or internal policy, including the Board of Trustees policy manual. In addition, the costs for that are the most recent available have been added for each individual audit. And additionally, a draft work plan is included in attachment B, which provides an overview of the types of activities that the audit committee undertakes during its tenure and an approximate schedule for those tasks. So as a reminder, this is for a discussion and presentation. If there are any questions about the revised list, I'm happy to answer them or mark them for follow-up.
Could I ask you to share your screen and just put them up for us to eyeball them together?
Give me 1 second.
That's okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll say that the formatting on here it may be a little hard to read, so let me know if you need to zoom in.
So the independent financial audit and the single audit we just discussed today. MGO is doing that. So if you can scroll, the state auditor is conducted by the California State Auditor. And when's the next time they're doing that?
It's scheduled for 2025.
Okay, so we don't need to do anything about that during this year. Okay, the cybersecurity. When's the next one due?
So there was a multi-part assessment that was conducted in 2023, but there's a biennial cybersecurity assessment that is requested by the audit committee. The previous one, I believe, was in 2022. So if the committee would like to see another biennial cybersecurity assessment, I believe that it would be due later this year.
Okay. I think cybersecurity is something of great concern and priority. And unless there's big objection, I would like us to plan to put something together for this year on that. Okay. The random case audit, that is an ongoing happens every year. The audit committee doesn't have to do anything to make that one happen, right?
Correct.
Same thing with the random case audit of the special deputy counsel. And for the internal controls assessment, when was it done last?
In my notes, so I believe that this is just completed. Yeah, the most recent review was discussed by the committee in July of 2023, so it won't be due.
So we don't need to do anything about this in the near future.
Correct.
All right. So I think from this list, I would say that the only one that needs a little special attention and follow-up would be the cybersecurity. I think one of the things that I would suggest, and maybe it's not an issue, but with the rise of what they call AI, the supposed artificial intelligence, I don't know that the threat from AI was specifically considered in the last, 2 years ago. This AI stuff's pretty recent. So I would certainly like that to be one of the factors that's specifically looked at. I don't know. I know very little about AI, but it is something that concerns me, and I want to make sure we're protected as a state bar in terms of our data, information, all the stuff that could go awry. Okay. Any questions, thoughts, or suggestions from committee members on the list that Elizabeth so kindly put together for us?
Mark, I just had a question about, you were talking about the cybersecurity. I'm not familiar with, but historically, have we had any attacks on the system? And I don't know, how did we deal with it, if any?
Leah, could I ask you to take that one?
Sure. Well, we've had not what I would characterize as an attack. We had an individual who was living at his mom's house in the basement, really successfully playing around with his computer skills, and he was able to access almost our entire record of disciplinary records, and so made those publicly available on a website called judyrecords.com. He kind of used his skills and did this across the country with many court systems. We weren't sort of the only victim, but I say it wasn't, we don't characterize it as an attack, because after researching it, it did not appear he was intending to attack us. But that was one sort of major incident that happened that we've been dealing with recently. Similarly, we've had folks figure out ways to access our admissions system databases. Again, I don't know that I would characterize it as a hack, but there are definitely vulnerabilities in our systems.
Thank you very much. I guess I think of it as data breach, because it kind of almost doesn't matter whether it was deliberate or kind of innocuous. We have a responsibility to do everything we can to prevent data breaches. This is confidential information that we have. Certainly discipline records and other records are extremely confidential and should be that way. And so I do think it's important for the state bar or any agency to be proactive and not only be responsive to when data breaches happen, but to figure out what we can put into place. And particularly, one of the things about technology, we know it can advance awful quickly. And I do think it's appropriate for us to do what we can to demonstrate, that we are doing a prudent job in protecting against data breaches, of learning from other agencies in California that have been subject to data breaches, figure out how it happened to them and what we can do to make sure it doesn't happen to us. So, part of my concern is that if someone who is, not attacking the system can get information, it makes me worried about those who may have reason, for whatever, who want to deliberately attack it. So I really appreciate the question very much, Trustee Buenaventura, and your response, Leah Wilson. Any other questions?
So I think we should continue the discussion that you started, Chair Tony, about looking at how we're doing on our new conflicts of interest policies and procedures and the various items that we put in place in the wake of the findings from the investigation regarding Tom Girardi. That those reforms were proposed by the ad hoc committee. I think that to institutionalize it, we should have that be part of our regular review of internal controls. And given the need to continue to build the trust of the legislature and increase trust of the public, I do think it's worth discussing whether we should have an external review of that as an initial matter. I know Annie previously made the point that typically these internal controls are reviewed internally, and I know that we already have an internal process to look at that. But I wonder whether the first, look at this after we've been implementing it should be by an external reviewer.
Thank you very much, Trustee Chen. I think that is something that bears further consideration, and I want to invite anybody else who has a thought or question or response to Trustee Chen's comment, proposal. I certainly would like a way to engage a external review at a reasonable cost.
All right, we'll look into that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, before we wrap up here, I just want to, open this up for any questions, suggestions, ideas you want to see on the next agenda. Okay, agenda items you'd like us to review, talk about. Okay. Well, that being the case, I would, unless there's any objection, I would like to adjourn the meeting. Given no further business, I'd like to thank everybody for attending, wish you a happy new year, and look forward to seeing you later this month at the State Bar Board of Trustees meeting in Los Angeles.
Thank you
Very much.